Good evening and welcome all from Blockchain NZ and Digital Identity NZ. It's a pleasure to host this event on the review of the Anti-Money Laundering and Countering Financing of Terrorism Act by the Ministry of Justice. I'm Brian Ventura. I'm a Senior Associate at Minter and Rudd Watts, and I'm also the Chair of Blockchain NZ. We're also joined by Colin Wallace, who's the Executive Director of Digital Identity NZ. We have 1 hour jam-packed with AML CFT goodness. Running through the agenda, Nick Coquet, Senior Policy Advisor from the Ministry of Justice, will give a background to the MOJ's review of the AML CFT Act. Senior Partner at Minter and Rudd Watts, Lloyd Kavanagh, and Director of AVID AML, Daniel Rogers, will briefly talk about the Digital Identity NZ report on the AML CFT regime. Then we'll move to our panel discussion. And I'm really excited to introduce our panel tonight. And the panel will answer two questions. Number one, they'll be answering what are the key issues to them that the ministry could consider with its review, the AML CFT Act. And then the second question is what changes could be made to the AML CFT Act. After the panel session, we'll invite the audience to request any questions to be answered through the Q&A box, and we'll wrap up at 6:30. Introducing our esteemed panel, we have Lloyd Kavanagh, Senior Partner at Minter and Rudd Watts. He's a financial services legal advisor specializing in AML CFT. We have Nick Coquet, Senior Policy Advisor at the Ministry of Justice, who I understand is leading the ministry's review of the AML CFT Act. We have Jeanine Granger, co-founder and CEO of Easy Crypto, New Zealand's largest broker of cryptocurrencies. We also have Claire Barber, CEO of Matter. Matter is a digital identity infrastructure provider here in New Zealand and a wholly owned subsidiary of Spark NZ. And we also have Daniel Rogers, a Director of AVID AML Limited, an AML CFT specialist based here in New Zealand. We can kindly please move to the next slide. I now invite Nick Coquet, who will give a background to the ministry's review of the AML CFT Act.
Thanks, Brian, and kia ora koutou. I hope you're all keeping well and safe wherever you are. And if you're in Auckland, obviously, I hope you're staying safe up there. So, as Brian said, I'm Nick Coquet. I'm a Senior Advisor at the Ministry of Justice and have the pleasure, the honour of leading the review of the AML CFT Act. But it's not just me doing it. There's the whole team of people that are working on the review from the ministry, but also from Department of Internal Affairs, from Police, Financial Markets Authority, Reserve Bank, and Customs. We're all really keen to use this review as a bit of a launch pad and to make the AML CFT Act the best that it can be for New Zealand. Before I get started, I also wanted to thank everyone for attending, but also for Digital Identity New Zealand, Matter, AVID AML, Minter and Rudd Watts, Blockchain New Zealand, and the broader Tech Alliance for getting this korero off the ground. It's a really key initiative. I'll come to this in a moment, but this is a really key part of the conversation that we want to have around digital identity and digital technology in supporting AML CFT outcomes. So, in terms of the review, it started on the 1st of July. The reason why we are doing a review is we're actually required to do it by law. We wanted to make sure that we reviewed the Act following mutual evaluation by the Financial Action Task Force, which concluded earlier this year. We have a year to do it. It has to finish by the 30th of June 2022. And right now, we have a consultation document that has been publicly released on the ministry's website, which outlines a whole suite of potential changes, potential issues that we've identified, we being the government, but also some private sector engagement on that, based off conversations that we've really had over the past few years since the regime has been around. We have an overall aspiration of trying to make New Zealand the hardest place for money laundering to occur, but we're balancing that aspiration with also wanting to make sure that that doesn't unnecessarily impair the ability for businesses to operate and for the economy to function. So as a result, there's going to be a lot of competing interests that we have, and we recognize that. We recognize that the whole AML CFT regime in general actually has a whole bunch of competing interests baked into it, because the government wants to prevent money laundering and terrorism financing from happening. Businesses also want to do that as well, but businesses also want to make sure that the compliance costs and efficiencies are realized as well. So there's a lot of reasons why we might end up recommending changes. Ultimately, what we will be doing is providing a report to the Minister of Justice that says to the Minister, hey, look, we should consider changing these things for the Minister to do with what he will. Ideally, the Minister will agree with us and then progress for the changes there. But that's a decision for Cabinet and for the ministers that they'll see when they get our report. But there's a lot of different competing interests, and we recognise that, and we want to understand those competing challenges, because government can only see things from government side, and we see a lot of the harm, we see a lot of the issues, and we obviously have our international obligations that we have to comply with, but we don't necessarily see what it's like on the coalface. We don't get the sense, or we don't have the same sense that everyone else has that's actually having to implement this regime, about what the challenges and the frustrations might be on a day-to-day basis. So this consultation, this korero, is really key for us to be able to actually understand that. And there's a lot of reasons why we might recommend changes, and we to be perfectly neutral. There's also the potential that we might not recommend any changes. I think that's a very, very slim chance, but that is a potential outcome there. But there's a few things that we want to look at. So one of which is that if there's any new areas of risk that that have been identified since the regime was brought in, whether there's anything that we need to do to address those risks. We've also just been evaluated by the Financial Action Task Force. So there's a question there around whether we can use this review to improve our compliance. And the big ones for the private sector probably are the fact that we want to make sure that compliance costs are proportionate with the risks. We want to hear those areas where compliance costs may not be proportionate, and what things that we can do to address those. And following on from that, we also want to avoid any unintended consequences. We hear that there's challenges that people have with opening or maintaining bank accounts. Those are sort of things that we want to try and resolve as much as we can. But the big one, and the reason why we're having this conversation, is that we want to modernize our Act. We recognize that the Act was introduced in 2009, and since then there's been a whole suite of technological developments that have been that have happened that we could and should take better advantage of, and that's I think going to be a really key thing that we want to try and achieve. But like I said, today is the core part of the conversation that we want to have, and the conversation doesn't finish with statutory review. Depending on what ministers end up doing with our report, the conversation will hopefully continue, and we'll have more and more dialogue around how to make this regime the best and start implementing those changes. So if we can just skip to the next slide, please. So there's a few, the consultation document that's been released, I said it's quite long. It is 100 and something pages. There's a whole range of issues that are raised. It really is reflecting that everything's up for grabs in this review. We want to, like I said, really make sure the regime works the best for everyone, and this is just a very short snippet. There is a lot up there, and if anyone's interested, encourage you to have a read, although it might be a bit soporific and put you to sleep, but that's no offense taken if that is the case. So there's a few key big questions that we're asking. So the regime, the Act has a purpose of detecting and deterring money laundering. Should we actually start thinking about whether or not we want to prevent money laundering and terrorism financing from happening? What does that look like? As I highlighted, there's this question around what we can do to address mitigate unintended consequences and ensure that people can access the formal financial system in a way that's safe for them. One big question that we are toying with is, do we need to have some registration and or licensing regime for businesses with AML obligations so we can have visibility of everyone that's in the system? We currently don't have visibility of everyone, particularly the non-financial businesses. There's one which I'm sure Jeanine's very interested in, is about the virtual asset service providers, whether they should have AML obligations. We want to work with virtual asset service providers to try and make sure that things work best for them and that things are proportionate. The next one, but there's also this question about, most businesses do what they're supposed to do, and that's really good, but there's some that don't. How can we make sure that the enforcement actions are actually going to encourage good compliance behavior? So those are some of the really big questions there, but there are, like I said, quite a few. And if we just skip to the next slide, the big ones that I think the topic for today's discussion is, how can we use new technology to better improve outcomes and efficiencies? So, like I said, there's been a massive explosion, and that trend is going to continue in terms of technological providers offering technological solutions. And we're actually at a bit of a turning point, and this conversation is happening in a really opposite time, because as many will know, the government's recently agreed to establish a digital identity trust framework with a bill that was introduced last month to bring that into law. That will hopefully set a really good foundation for making digital technology digital identity accessible for Aotearoa in general. But also on the global side of things, the Financial Action Task Force has done quite a lot of thinking, is continuing to do quite a lot of work in this space. So they've released guidance in 2020 about using for governments actually to take on board for how to better use digital ID as part of AML CFT, and they recognise explicitly that it can actually be better than the current situation of relying on in person. And then the other there's been also a recent report looking at new technologies more generally about supporting regulatory outcomes. And we think that we haven't fully tapped the potential, and we know that we fully haven't tapped the potential. So we want to really hear from businesses about what we can do, what we can use, and if you're trying to but you can't, why can't you? What are the things that are preventing you from doing that? But if we talk about but there's digital ID as well. There's digital technology. We want to hear about whether there's anything that the government can do to better support that. So the FATF has recently talked about, some things that government should be thinking about to actually better support these outcomes. So, and identified a whole suite of challenges, and I won't run through those because it's not the most exciting read, but they are in the consultation document, and it's really encourage people to have a look at them, because we really, like I said, want to have that conversation about things. And I don't want to steal Digital Identity New Zealand's thunder about it, but today they've released produced a really good report that has identified some of the issues, and we want to hear from people whether that's their experience, and are the recommendations in those reports things that you would like to see as well. And finally, on Reliance, this is something that's been in the regime since the start, but we see that there's not having the same uptake that it could have. We want to understand why is that? Is that something that in the Act that's preventing you from doing that, or is it concerns about liability? What can we do better in that space to really support it? So I'll finish there because that was a very lengthy discussion about things, but basically tell us what's going on. We want to hear from you. We want to see what we can do to make things better.
Many thanks, Nick. We now pass it on to Lloyd Kavanagh, who will speak further.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you very much, Nick, first of all, for making the time to beam in and be part of this event, and to engage with Digital Identity New Zealand and Blockchain New Zealand because this is a critical audience for the work that you're doing in terms of the AML review. I really want to give a big shout out to all the participants. I see we've got 165 online at the moment, which is a fantastic turnout, and really encourage them to ignore Nick's comments about his soporific document. It's not really at all. In fact, very helpfully, the ministry has provided a shorter summary document which helps you cross-reference to the long document and the bits you might want to read. I really encourage you to take the time to at least read the summary and then to make a submission, because this is a once in a decade at best opportunity to have a say in relation to a particularly important piece of law that impacts all of the businesses that are represented here one way or another. And I want to have a big shout out not only to the existing reporting entities who know about the regime, but basically anyone online who's taken advice and come to the conclusion, or not taken advice and come to the conclusion that the regime currently doesn't apply to them, still or even more read the document, because there are some questions being asked which indicate potential expansion. So I think Nick happily called out virtual asset service providers where they've asked questions. My reading of the wording is probably, if you were a betting person, you'd put money on some kind of greater clarity and potentially expansion of coverage. So this is your chance, address it. Either contact Brian or Daniel if you need some help or guidance. The two organisations are not themselves putting in submissions, but you might well find that you can band together with people who you might regard as competitors but have a common interest on this topic. Make sure you're heard is the key message. I now want to move on to the next slide, please, to talk just a little bit about this report that Digital Identity issued, a year ago, and the work that was done to produce it was actually the 18 months prior to that. So this report was really driven by a desire to explore the reliance and reuse of identity verification under the AML CFT Act in the context of a coming trust framework bill, which is now in front of Parliament. But it really, if you want to find something that's soporific, Nick, that's probably a harder read, I have to say, but it is really useful as a background resource to work through. So the genesis was that DINZ convened this work being done. They lined up 6 of New Zealand's larger banks and Matter, who's also represented, and the DIA and the AML supervisors and ourselves to work together with a report. And the work was done by myself and Brian, who's comparing the session. And what we were doing was exploring a bunch of issues, in particular some of the frictions and experience, particularly by the participating banks and also by Matter when they were performing CDD, and then proposing particular things that might be done about it. Now, some of those are highlighted on the recommendations are highlighted on the PowerPoint slide, but there's a lot more in there, and it's a useful background resource. So you can get a copy of that from Digital Identity NZ or from us. Drop an email to Brian, and we're happy to share that. But it serves as a really good starting point for some of the questions that you might want to elaborate on. And I know that Nick has seen it already, but he'll be very interested to know whether a year, actually nearly 2 years after a chunk of the work was done, those are continuing to be concerns for the sector. So that's really all I wanted to say about that report.
Thanks, Lloyd. Before we move to the panel session, Daniel, would you like to add anything on that report?
No, I think Lloyd's covered everything off on that. I'd be repeating his work.
Sorry about that, Daniel.
No, that's okay.
That's fantastic. Well, I'm really excited to start our panel session now. We've introduced the panelists, and we've asked each of them to answer 2 questions. The first question we've asked is, what are the key issues the ministry could consider with its review of the AML CFT Act? And if we can have Lloyd start, please.
Okay. And Brian, are we going to take each question by question? Maybe if we all do the first question and then we come back and do the second, do you think?
That's right. Good idea.
Yep, perfect. So it was great to hear Nick using the word that I think is the key that I'd ask the ministry to have regard to, which is balance. I think we're all very clear that we don't want New Zealand to be a place where money laundering or terrorism financing goes on. But at the same time, that does really need to be balanced. And in particular, there are 3 things that I feel very strongly about, and people are making submissions, maybe they reflect on. First of all is that issue of financial inclusion. And it is a reality that a material number of New Zealanders are currently, to a degree, excluded from the traditional financial system. And unfortunately, that inadvertently increases AML risk because it forces them into a black economy where they're unable to participate in a legitimate way. And I think it's really important we address some of those frontier issues. The second thing is, I think there's some work to do in relation to innovation, and that will be particularly resonate with this audience. My view, there's no point in us increasing global AML CFT risk by forcing New Zealanders to get their financial services in particular from overseas providers because no one wants to base themselves here. So we end up exporting talent instead of exporting services. So we do need to have a look at the way the regime works in a few places to facilitate innovation by responsible, dedicated people who want to comply with the regime. And then thirdly, efficiency is important, and that efficiency is one of the key issues, really going back to that report we did a year ago, and which I can see Nick has picked up on some of them already, where it's not helping reduce money laundering or terrorism financing risk, but it's just doing stuff over and again. And there are great opportunities, I think, for the businesses that are represented here to contribute positively to more efficient processes, reducing the drag on the economy, but still getting the benefit. So that's really the key theme that I'm hoping the ministry will pick up. I do understand you have international pressure from FATF and also, our good friends at the police, FIU, who would like to have visibility on everything all the time, and those are important. But please, Nick, make sure that we don't lose the wood for the trees. That's all for me on the first question.
Thanks for that, Lloyd. I'll pick up on the second panel. So I think that digital identification interoperability is probably the future that I really want to focus on with this. Amending the Act to extend identity verification code of practice will give us greater control, greater trust, and also help us reduce the cost on business as well. The consumer data rights is looking at sharing identification data across larger organizations. I think it'd be really good to include digital ownership, sovereign data ownership in that equation as well. So giving the response back to the actual individual on who sees what and how it's shared. and also focus on encouraging the use of digital identity technology as well. You know, Nick mentioned that before, and I've seen a couple of comments in the chat around technology being able to share that data and the ownership of that data staying with the individual as well. Transportability of the documentation is really important as well from a customer experience perspective. So it makes it easier for people to access banking and financial services. So it really addresses that inclusion question. And it also focuses and reduces the cost for firms as well. So not just in time, but also in expenses. So part of that is really setting us up to prepare for an eventual more globalized standard, a more acceptable standard. And it goes towards becoming more of a tech economy, exactly what Lloyd was talking about, rather than exporting our expertise with people, really exporting our technology. So there's a few things that we need to focus on to do that, driving the trust framework with global standards, extending safe harbor to facilitate verifiable credentials, including possibly reporting that on a public ledger, and also incorporating global standards. So Nick mentioned before, digital ID assurance framework and technical standard settings with FATF, for example. That's really what I think I'd like to see from this.
So I might follow on from those things. Like, I kind of agree with all three speakers so far, and I particularly wanted to say to Nick, I think, you know, this area is really important. The last thing any of us wants to see are bad actors do bad things, use money inappropriately, launder money, do all those terrible things that people do, and that this legislation has been created to try to prevent. I think Lloyd's point on balance is a really important one. And I think really this is such a great opportunity for us to have a modernisation conversation, because if we really do want the best outcomes that we can have for New Zealand and to prevent money laundering and prevent terrorism activities and a whole bunch of other bad things, then we need to take advantage of the tools that have evolved and become available to us since 2009. And that's quite a long time ago. And things have continued to move on. And I think that automatically we go straight to the tech. But to my mind, there's a bunch of other enablers that allow the tech to be effective. The tech's a tool, right? And the tech can be used to do lots of different things in lots of ways, and it itself can be an enabler. But I think that there are broader alignment issues that need to be solved for. We need to be really clear about the roles that different parties play in an ecosystem, and we need to provide clarity that means that people aren't afraid to play those roles. And I think the lack of clarity around liability in some cases, or fear about liability issues, is a constraint on how people act. I also think that public sector has some very important roles to play that it could play in a different way to the way that it plays today. So, for example, governments themselves are sources of authoritative data on a range of different topics. And quite often, those can act as trust anchors in an ecosystem. And they can play a very important function when we are trying to establish the basis on which we trust something. And trust is fundamentally a human construct, not a technology one. So we have to start to define the rules of the road around what we can trust and to what level in a way that isn't punitive. So I think that there's work to do there. And some of that work starts in really sort of basic ways. For example, it's relatively easy today to register a company in New Zealand, and you don't really have to prove anything about yourself in the process of registering that company. So as we start to rely on things, it becomes more tricky to rely on things that haven't been checked on the way in. And that puts pressure further down in the supply chain of the system to make up for the lack of checks and balances on the way in. So I think government, is an authoritative source of data in many contexts in this country. And there are practical things that we can do to improve the quality of onboarding processes, which allows us to then create claims at higher assurance levels throughout the ecosystem. And I'm really interested in collaborating with anyone who's interested in solving those problems, because the stronger that we can make those trust foundations, the more we can enable the technology to create network effect benefits from the strength of that data. We have new tools available to us today that allow us to bind, to bind information to devices and to bind devices to people. And the combination of those binding techniques and high information assurance, so good quality processes that help us to be confident about the quality of the information on the way in, create infinite potential for innovation. And I think, businesses are struggling. I don't think anybody gets out of bed in the morning with an intent to breach a process or not comply with something. I don't think people typically have bad intent in the roles that we perform in our day-to-day work. But the lack of tools and the lack of foundations and the lack of an aligned plan on what we will trust, what we will accept, creates sort of a lot of pressure for organizations. And then you add in real world problems like the ones that Lloyd mentioned in the context of digital inclusion, for example, or equity of access to financial services. You add in things like a global pandemic, which forces social distancing and means that people can't turn up in person with their pieces of paper to sit through interviews and have trusted witness type things in an in-person fashion. And you have yourself a recipe for, a lot of difficulty and a lot of wastage and some pretty suboptimal outcomes all round, which don't necessarily lead to reducing bad actors and the things that they get away with. So I would argue we need a really coordinated approach, an aligned approach, which looks at the problem holistically, not just through a technology lens, but recognizing the new tools that are available, and seeks to improve our understanding of what we can rely on, and where we start from a weaker foundation puts the commitment into uplifting the basis of trust on critical information sources, starting with government first. And I think if we do that, then we will have greater international standing. I think the work that MFAT's been doing on the Digital Economy Partnering Agreement, the DEPA agreement that it forged with New Zealand, Chile, and Singapore last year, was a really interesting foundational piece of work. And I'm very hopeful that at APEC this year, we'll see that agreement be extended to include more countries. If we can get our roots of trust well anchored as a country, then I think we've got really firm foundations that will allow us not just to achieve better compliance outcomes within our borders, but also to support much more innovation across borders as well. So a few things to think about there.
Thanks very much, Claire. That was awesome and great benefit of going behind so many great speakers is now I've got a lot of pieces to pick up and everyone's already said a lot of things that I wanted to cover. But Ahi ahi Maria koutou ko Jeanine Granger ho. I'm Jeanine Granger, the CEO of Easy Crypto. The first point that I really want to make is to applaud MOJ for consulting on this. As Nick mentioned, this was a legislative requirement for this review to happen, but the way in which MOJ have been going about this is incredibly consultative, incredibly keen to embrace what people want to say about this, and I think that's really a fantastic way to go about it. And I would really strongly encourage everyone here to meet that consultation head on and get engaged, because it's one thing for the government to go out and want to engage with us, but we need to meet halfway and really have our say. So if you're on this call, there's 167 people here. I personally would love to see each and every one make a submission, even if it's just small, because it's a really great way to have your say in democracy and have all those comments coming through in the sidebar, get them into the submissions in with MOJ. So from my point of view around this question of what are the key issues that MOJ should consider, as Lloyd touched on at the beginning, it's really about balance, and legislation, like many things in life, is about trade-offs. And there's a lot of inherent trade-offs in this legislation in particular, but there's 3 that I really want to call out as I think being the most important. The first one, which again has been touched on, is around the cost and benefits. There's trade-offs between costs and benefits, and there's also consideration that needs to be given of where the costs sit and where the benefits lie. So I'd love to see this as a framework for regulation more broadly, but particularly for this Act to consider the impacts of each of the changes or each of the existing pieces in the Act and what costs that causes for individuals and for businesses and society. Looking at identity verification, which is obviously one of the key components of this and something that's come up a lot in the chat on the sidebar here. That's a cost to the private sector, which is then passed on to consumers, so to people like you and I at the end of the day. And obviously it does create economic benefit in terms of new industries and jobs, as Daniel can possibly attest, but it does create significant cost across sectors and a lot of duplication of costs as well. And as someone's just said in the chat, it is the cost for small businesses that is probably disproportionately borne, and also the cost for people who are less, have disadvantages or exclusion from the financial sector. So for me personally, I've gone through about 8 compliance processes for AML in the last 2 months. I've gone through a house sale and purchase agreement, and I've also had a business sale. And with those things, I've had so many different AML processes that I've had to go through. Some of them I've had to pay for directly as the customer, but others I can only assume that I pay for through fees from using that business. And the cost to me, though, are not just financial, it's also the time and the effort and the risk of my identity being disclosed and having to do that over and over again to parties where I don't actually have a choice about disclosing my identity to them. If I want to engage with them, I have to disclose that. And that puts me in a position of, either I transact on my house transaction or I don't. And that really brings me to the second trade-off, which is the trade-off between privacy and transparency. Now, obviously, we need a level of transparency in order for the AML CFT Act to achieve its purpose, which is to detect and deter money laundering and the financing of terrorism. But we can't lose sight of the fact that 99% of financial activity is from honest individuals and companies and people wanting to conduct legitimate businesses. And people should have the right to conduct business without undue interference, and they definitely should have the right to privacy. And this is obviously something that we hold really dearly. We have a Privacy Act. It's something that people care about a lot. And there is a conflict between what the AML CFT Act is trying to do and privacy. And this is something that, I come from a blockchain and crypto background, and privacy is a little bit baked into what we do and what we care about. And it's something that I think there's a little bit of a misnomer that people think, well, I have nothing to hide, so therefore what do I care? But the point of privacy isn't to aid people who have something to hide, it's to ensure we have a fair, open and free society. So it is something we should all care about. So this is where, and I think we'll probably talk about this in the next section, but this is something where a digital identity framework could really help. Something called zero knowledge proof, where you can retain your identity. You don't have to disclose the details of yourself or your identity, whilst still being able to transact with businesses to give them assurances that they are meeting compliance lines and meeting their requirements without the individual having to go through unnecessary risk or invasion of privacy. So that's sort of the key trade-offs that I think, the trade-off between costs and benefits, the trade-offs between privacy and transparency. And the other one, which I don't have time to go into, unfortunately, is the trade-off between the broad principle-based approach and a specific detailed-based approach. And one thing that I would just really briefly encourage MOJ on there is to keep New Zealand regulation adaptive, not prescriptive, because there's been a lot of wins for New Zealand regulatory environment from being adaptive and moving with the times, whereas prescriptive regulation creates a lot of cost and also struggles to keep up. So thanks very much. That's my 2 cents on what should be considered.
Fantastic. Nick, you're welcome to join this panel discussion as well. Anything to add?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I think it's been obviously a lot of food for thought, so I won't rehash or attempt to respond to anyone that said. I think that it's appropriate for us to take it away. Also, Jeanine, the suggestion of having 167 submissions come through is a little galling. It does take a bit of time for us to actually go through and analyze all those submissions, but nonetheless, I think one of the key things though that everyone's been talking about, and it's been really key in the chat, is that trade-off between privacy and transparency. I mean, there's a whole bunch of really important outcomes that the AML CFT regime achieves. You know, it allows us to detect when people are misusing the economy. It allows us to investigate those people, hold them to account, and recover their assets. It makes it harder for people to do so in the first place, and that's, you know, and those are all really laudable outcomes, and that does make New Zealand hopefully a safer place to be. I think that does come at a cost. It comes at not just that compliance cost, which we're all obviously familiar with, but that cost to the erosion of privacy. And it's an interesting one to consider, and I think it's going to be a bit of a challenge for the government to really grapple with this, because you know, there's a tendency with regulation to have it as a bit of a ratchet, where as soon as you give up privacy, it's harder to get it back. The horse is bolted, so to speak. But it is a conversation that we are really interested to have, and it's obviously coming up in the chat, and it sounds like it's a lot of things, something that really people are keen to comment on. So we do really encourage you to think about it, and if there are better ways to achieve the outcomes of knowing who your customer is, but without knowing who they are, to the extent that we can achieve that, I think we should look at it earnestly, because, you know, there are some concerns. There's lots of concerns about the intrusion of the government, and while New Zealand is a safe country and we are an uncorrupt government, that's not true for every country, and every country is expected to have this sort of regime, and our information does get shared, and it's a concern that I feel as a customer when I go to a bank, and I also feel the frustrations that people have when they try and open up a new bank account. I only have myself to blame, of course. I can't blame anyone else. But needless to say, I think it is a lots of difficult things for us to consider there, but it's something that we should be considering. So if people, you know, want to put forward things, please do. We welcome those thoughts.
Excellent responses from the panel. We now have about 15 minutes to answer the next question. And the next question is, what updates should be made or could be made to the AML CFT Act? Lloyd?
Okay, I'm going to keep this pretty crisp. I think, Brian, if there's interest and we run a little long, then we should just do that, because the dialogue is fantastic. I'm going to call out 3 things. 2 of them in particular were in the DINZ report. Number 1 is address. Now, I don't know if people know, but globally, not every legitimate and strong AML regime requires proof of address, because in many countries, people have an identification number, and that's done. The reason in our Anglo-Saxon world we have address is we don't have an identity card. But having said that, so it's, you know, if my name is John Smith, and I was born on the 20th of October 1970, there might be another John Smith born on that date, so you need something. But if you look at your passport, actually it uses place of birth. And address is not only a big problem to prove, but it's very exclusionary, because increasing numbers of people do not have proof of address for all sorts of reasons. Number 2, the Act already has an approved entity reliance regime, which has never been activated. And I really think that a lot of greater reliance could be facilitated by tweaking that regime a little and issuing the regulations. It would require someone to be the supervisor of approved entities who are going to be relied on, but frankly, we've now moved on where the DIA has a key lead role in this, and there will be businesses who want to step up and do that. And then lastly, in the consultation, I'm really delighted to see some discussion about licensing of some of the external service providers or agents, because I think if that was activated, it also facilitates a lot more new entrants into the market to do things without having to do everything themselves. And there is a whole business that people could operate where they have an official status, and you know they're going to perform to a level, and then others can contract with them to help. So those are my 3. I have a lot of others, but I think I should pass over to the rest of the panel. I think you're next. Are you clear?
I think it's Daniel.
Daniel.
Yeah, it's me that follows Lloyd, discussing the same report. So remind me next time not to follow you, Lloyd. Just want to touch on a few things as well, very similar points, but the activating the approved entity regime, I think will go a long way to setting us up for a better framework. And we really need to make sure that digital identity providers are held to higher levels of identity assurance. And also we should be having a look to make sure the Electronic ID Verification Act could include decentralized identity platforms. So we're looking to make sure that we're enhancing the ability for new entrants to simplify and reduce costs while making sure that we're focusing very much on trust. Now, trust and privacy are obviously key to this. Having the ability for us to rely on those on external firms, and making sure as well that we have ownership of that data, but also control over that data, I think is critical in developing any particular any future frameworks. The decentralization of verifiable credentials is quite important. In my view, it enables us to hand that ownership back to the individual, back to that customer. And also the flow-on effect, of course, is reducing cost quite significantly. Including and looking at the Privacy Commissioner for sharing of the AML CFT information under the interim trust framework, and expanding the liability safe harbor as well within that framework, I think is quite important to be able to make sure that we have the ability to use the risk-based approach to identify high risk and low risk and act accordingly, I think is quite important.
Yeah, I really agree with Daniel. And of course, I work in the decentralized identity space. So very hard for me to argue that anything other than what he said there. I think it's really important. We've got new tools, capabilities have moved on. I think Jeanine made some excellent points. I think having legislation that's too prescriptive in an environment where the tools are constantly evolving is actually really probably the worst thing that we can do. So making sure that we create the opportunity for adaptive legislation that can accommodate the changing world that we live in and bring those benefits to bear in the form of solutions more quickly to help us to achieve the outcomes we're all seeking. I still come back to the fact that I think that there is a massive need for alignment. And I think that's across the legislative space as well. I mean, it's, you know, I'm no lawyer, I'm definitely not qualified in that department, neither am I a policymaker, but I do think that if you look at the legislation that's out there, there are so many different pieces that sort of semi-contradict each other. If they don't fully contradict each other, it's really confusing for your average human to figure out what they should be doing and how they all fit together. So we need really simple alignment exercise and modernization exercise across all of the related pieces of legislation so that it removes all of the fishhooks and kind of conflicting advice, and then some really clear and you know, kind of outcome focused guidelines that support robust and effective outcomes, but with a focus on providing people with things that they can do rather than just long lists of concerns of what might happen to them if they don't do something perfectly. So I think it has to be less punitive and it has to be more about enablement overall. And I don't know how you do that in law. I think that's, you know, good luck. I'm really vested in the outcome here, but I think that's a difficult thing to ask for. But I'm very interested in what we can do to support that as a general direction.
Thanks, Claire. All right, my turn for the shopping list at the AML CFT Act regime. Like all good COVID shopping lists, I think I'm going to put out what I'm looking for, and some things I'll be willing to accept substitutes on, and other things I think, you know, I'd probably, you know, definitely like to make sure I get them delivered. So the first one is as Lloyd said, the proof of address verification. I've seen some comments in the chat that this isn't that hard. As someone who onboards thousands of customers every week, I can attest that it is difficult. It's a pain in the ass, it's costly, it's slow, it slows customers down. And I really don't think the value that it adds is that significant. As someone did say to me once, if the police need me collecting proof of address to help them find criminals, we've probably got bigger problems to worry about. And it's also out of line with, you know, what's been done in other jurisdictions globally. So I think let's just scrap that one. And if we could scrap it tomorrow, I would be super happy. But I am willing to accept substitutes on this item on my shopping list. For example, we could, you know, as Claire talked about, there's a lot of digital tools out there, things that we could be leveraging and using to provide better ways to find people. If that's what address is looking for, we can do things like IP address, geolocation, device ID. There's a lot of digital options out there that could achieve the same thing with a lot less stress and hassle. Chains of Reliance is that second item on my shopping list. And as Nick said, there is options around this, but they're not well understood. They're not usable. As a reporting entity, I can't go and just rely on things like the fact that my customers all have a New Zealand bank account and then not go and do customer due diligence myself. The system isn't clear and it's not easy for me to know who I can rely on and what for. And this also creates a lot of those issues and complexities around verification onboarding, people having to do that multiple times and over again because reporting entities can't rely on each other. And the last thing on my shopping list is around the VASP legislation or regulation specifically. Like I said earlier, we've got these great adaptive regulations in many places in New Zealand. And in fact, the fact that we have adaptive regulations mean that most VASPs, and I think all VASPs in New Zealand, are already covered. Sorry, I should backtrack a little bit just in case we didn't pick it up before. VASP is the terminology for virtual asset service provider. So companies like Easy Crypto, which sell cryptocurrencies, also companies that create new cryptocurrencies, exchange them, or potentially store or provide custody for cryptocurrencies would be covered under the Act. So most of the cryptocurrency businesses in New Zealand are already covered because we have this adaptive regulatory regime. So I'd really encourage, and you know, no substitutes here probably, let's keep an adaptive regime because the space that I work in is evolving very, very fast. And we need to think about what the principles we're trying to achieve are rather than the specifics or the details, because checking details in the legislation will be a headache for us all to comply with in the future when things evolve to a point that's past what we could imagine today. So that is my shopping list. And look, if we can also remove GoAML, get New Zealand PEPs on board, and perhaps a few other little changes as well, I'd be super happy.
Thanks, Jeanine. I'll just round off. Again, obviously, there's not going to necessarily say what updates should be made because that's the whole point of the review. But I just want to pick up on a couple of things. The address point that has been spoken to by Lloyd and Jeanine and quite comprehensively in the chat. It's a really good point. There's like Lloyd said, there's a lot of countries that don't require it. Australia also it's optional. You don't have to do it. It's not actually required by the standards, the international standards from the Financial Action Task Force, to have address verification. So we do want to hear from people about that, because it is one of those classic policy conundrums where you have very clear competing interests, but not only competing interests between the same person, but competing interests between the public sector and law enforcement agencies and the private sector who bear the cost. So it's be good. But I think we want to make sure that this regime works, makes the best use of technology that exists. We do recognise the challenges that a lot of people have in terms of having to provide the same identity information to different businesses. We also recognise that reporting entities have difficulties and challenges with relying on each other for that information. There's, like I said in my opening, there's a lot of potential for the regime to leverage the new technology and distributed ledger technology, which other countries have been starting to do, and the FATF has called out and said, you know, cool. Let's keep going. But I think the challenge is that we don't understand these things as well as the private sector do. So help us help you in a sense. And we do saying earlier on is that most of us are on technology that's 15 years old. So the extent to which we understand new technology and in our day-to-day lives, we do want to hear from you and be guided by the private sector's views on that, because there's there's potential, and we're not realizing it as well as we could have. So very keen, and thank you to everyone for their suggestions, and particularly around that Reliance piece. The DINZ report goes to this in quite a lot of really good detail, talking about the liability concerns. So let's have a conversation around that. Let's see if we can make the Reliance piece work better to enable collaboration and partnership across the economy, but also between private and public sector.
Fantastic responses. Thanks all. We don't have much time for questions from the audience, but we have a couple of questions already. Number one, does the ministry have a view on the future of consumer data rights, open banking, and the role that can play in the review?
Yeah, I mean, so it's not an area that I'm particularly familiar with. It's a lot of things that the Reserve Bank has been looking at, but like the open banking has a real potential to be a paradigm shift, and in terms of how people access their banking and financial services. I think the last thing that I would want to see is for AML to get in the way of that innovation.
Fantastic. And another question, what technology is New Zealand planning to use for what I think is the digital identity trust framework? That the question.
I'll take that maybe. I don't think they've made their mind up yet, and there's no policy decision on that I've seen. So the DIA recently issued an RFI, an open RFI for response from industry, but they haven't been specific so far. I think what's really worth the read is Joanne Knight's standards. Joanne Knight works at the DIA, her standards around digital identity. And they're written, well, they're not for digital identity, they're assurance level standards for all types of identity verification. They're worth the read if you want to see directionally where the standards are going, but I don't think they've made a technology decision.
Well, thanks all. If there's any other questions, it'll be great to continue the dialogue perhaps at another event. Before we wrap up, I'd like to invite anyone here who's interested in joining the New Zealand Tech Alliance, Blockchain NZ, or Digital Identity NZ to reach out. There's some websites here on that PowerPoint. And I'd also like to invite Ben Tairia, who'll wrap up with a karakia, please.
Awesome. Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Benjamin Tairia toku no Kokearani Aho. Thank you everybody for attending. What an awesome discussion. Thank you very much. Nama nui kia koutou e te taumātua nā rangatira. Thank you for your to our panelists. E te kai korero, Brian Ventura, thank you very much. Tēnā koe. It was awesome. Thank you for hosting us. I have the privilege, as Brian has said, to close us off with a karakia. So I'll do that now. Oni hoia te pō whiri marama, tamakia te ao whate tangata. Tātā ki roa, tātā ki raro, tātā hui rau, haumie hui e, tāiki. Awesome. Thank you very much, everybody. Ka kite ana.